room behind an Egyptian temple has been flooding for over 100 years. Inside, 10 granite pillars rise out of the water, some blocks weighing close to 100 tons. There is no mortar holding them together. None. The joints are cut so tightly that a blade cannot fit between the stones.
The water rises up from the water table to create this island in the middle, which perhaps is why it's given the name the Osirion. We have much later evidence of activity here.
The doorways stand over 12 feet tall, far too high for any person who ever lived there. Someone built this before Egypt had a name for itself. And whoever they were, nothing about this room proves they were human at all. The ground Seti would not build on. Egypt has thousands of ancient ruins, temples, tombs, pyramids, all fully explained, all dated, all understood. But hidden behind one of Egypt's greatest temples is a room that breaks every rule. It's called the Osirion. And for over 100 years, nobody has been able to explain how it was built, or who really built it. To understand why this room is such a problem, you need to see where it's hiding. Abydos sits on the western bank of the Nile in southern Egypt, roughly 300 miles south of Cairo. For 3,000 years, this was the most sacred ground in the country, and it was here that a pharaoh named Seti I built one of the finest temples in Egyptian history, covered top to bottom in detailed carvings, home to a famous list of Egyptian kings cut into solid stone. But walk behind that temple, just 26 feet back, and the ground drops lower, and sitting in that lower ground is the Osirion. Here's what should immediately bother you. Seti's builders did not build over it, they built around it. The back of his temple bends, it narrows, it reroutes itself, like something was already sitting there that nobody was allowed to touch. Most researchers now agree on one explanation. The Osirion was already standing before Seti ever arrived. So why did this ground matter enough for a pharaoh to build his temple around it instead of through it? Because the Egyptians believed this exact spot held the body of Osiris, their god of death. Legend said his body had been torn apart and scattered across the country, and his most sacred remains were buried right here. This wasn't a story told for entertainment. It was the center of Egyptian religion. Only priests allowed through secret initiation could go near it. Everyone else stayed back. And this ground didn't just hold myths. It held real bodies, killed for real reasons. Less than 2 miles from Seti's temple, archaeologists found the tomb of an early king named Jer, surrounded by 318 separate graves. Another 269 graves circle the area around it. Most of the people buried there were young women, likely taken from his own household. And here's the detail that makes this impossible to look away from. Every one of those graves shares the same roof. That means every person inside them died on the same day, buried together the moment their king was buried. Hundreds of people, killed at once, sent to follow him into whatever came next. This is the ground the Osirion was built on. Ground already soaked in death long before Seti ever showed up. And in 1902, when archaeologists finally dug down into the lower ground behind his temple, what they found didn't just look ancient, it looked wrong. What they found in the water. In 1902, a team of archaeologists started digging behind Seti's temple. The dig was led by Edward Naville, working for the Egypt Exploration Fund. Alongside him was Margaret Murray, a careful and thorough researcher, working under the direction of the famous archaeologist Flinders Petrie. None of them had any idea what they were about to find. The entrance was a stone passage stretching 69 meters straight down into the earth. It led them away from Seti's bright, painted temple walls and into total darkness. The deeper they went, the more water covered the ground beneath their feet. By the time they reached the bottom, they weren't walking anymore. They were wading. This wasn't a normal excavation. This was a slow crawl through rising water into a chamber that had been sealed shut and forgotten for thousands of years. And then their torches caught it. 10 massive pillars, cut from solid red granite, rose out of the water in 2 straight rows, holding up giant stone blocks above them. Some of those blocks weighed close to 100 tons. That's roughly the weight of 15 fully grown elephants, held up by nothing but stone balanced on stone. To put that in perspective, the largest blocks inside the Great Pyramid's most famous chamber weigh between 50 and 80 tons. What Naval and Murray were staring at was heavier than anything ever found inside Egypt's most legendary structure. But the weight wasn't even the most disturbing part. These blocks were fitted together with no mortar at all, no glue, no filler, nothing holding them together except the way they were cut. And they were cut so precisely that a knife blade could not fit between them, not even at the corners, not even after thousands of years underwater. The surfaces were smooth and polished, clearly finished with real skill and patience, not rushed. This wasn't a structure thrown together quickly. This was built by someone who wanted it to survive long after they were dead. Here's why that detail mattered so much to Naval and Murray in that exact moment. Nothing about this matched what a 19th dynasty structure was supposed to look like. Seti's temple, just a short walk away, was covered top to bottom in paint and carvings, exactly what you'd expect from that era. This space had none of that. No color, no decoration, just cold, silent stone, stacked with a level of precision that felt completely out of place for its time. And that mismatch is what unsettled them the most. The dig itself was brutal. Groundwater kept rising around their boots the entire time, sometimes faster than they could clear it. Large sections of the lower structure stayed completely underwater, no matter how hard they worked. Every step forward meant more mud, more cold, more stone they couldn't fully see or study, hiding just below the surface. By the time they finally climbed back out, one question followed them out of that chamber and never left. If this wasn't built the way anything else from Seti's time was built, then who actually built it? And how long had it been sitting there, silent and flooded, before Seti's reign ever began? That question turned out to be far harder to answer than anyone expected. Because once you look closely at how this granite was actually cut and placed, the truth is simple and unsettling. The stone. That shouldn't be possible. The granite used to build this structure did not come from anywhere near Abydos. It was cut from quarries at Aswan, roughly 250 miles away, and somehow transported all that distance to this exact spot. Blocks weighing up to 100 tons moved 250 miles, using methods that the historical record from that time period does not clearly explain. That is not speculation. That is a genuine, unanswered problem sitting at the center of Egyptian archaeology. And it gets stranger the closer you look. The question of how ancient Egyptians managed to cut granite this precisely has confused experts since 1883, when the famous archaeologist Flinders Petrie first raised it publicly. That is not a new mystery invented for internet videos. That is a real documented gap in our understanding that has existed for well over 100 years. Here is the physical evidence that keeps the question alive. Inside ancient Egyptian granite quarries, archaeologists have found drill holes that are almost perfectly circular. No chipping, no rough edges, no sign of a shaky hand. That kind of clean, smooth result is usually only possible with controlled, steady drilling. Yet the tools believed to have been available at the time were simple copper and stone, tools that should not have been strong enough to cut through granite this cleanly. The most common explanation offered by mainstream experts is that ancient workers used a mix of copper tools, sand as an abrasive, and enormous amounts of patient, repeated labor over long periods of time. This is possible, but even now, modern experiments have never fully recreated stonework of this scale and precision, using only those methods. Because of this gap, a smaller group of researchers, including engineer and author Christopher Dunn, have proposed a far more unsettling idea. They argue that some of Egypt's most precisely cut stonework does not match the tool capabilities of that era at all and may belong to an older, more advanced tradition that history has completely lost. This theory sits outside the mainstream. It is not accepted fact, but it exists and it deserves to be heard because nobody has been able to fully disprove it either. There is also a darker cost hiding behind even the mainstream explanation. If ordinary human labor really did move 100-ton blocks across 250 miles using ropes, wooden sleds, and river transport, that labor would have demanded an enormous number of workers, pushed to their physical limit. It is not hard to imagine that some of them never made it to the end of that journey. This mirrors something we already uncovered earlier, a civilization at Abydos that was already willing to bury hundreds of people alongside their king. Whether the truth is patient human effort, a lost method history forgot, or something else entirely, one fact remains standing in the middle of it all. This stone should not have been possible to shape this precisely using the tools we are told were available. But the stone is not the only thing that does not add up here. Because once you look past the granite and start reading what is actually carved into its walls, an even stranger problem appears. One with Seti's own name written all over it. The forged signature. Carved into the walls of this structure are the names of Seti I and his successor, Merimta. Their royal symbols, called cartouches, are the only direct written evidence connecting this structure to Seti's time period at all. For years, this was treated as solid proof. But when you actually study how these carvings were made, the story falls apart fast. Here is the problem. In ancient Egypt, when a king built something, inscriptions were planned into the design from the very beginning. Walls were carefully shaped and smoothed specifically to hold detailed writing. Every temple across Egypt followed this pattern, but the carvings here are different. They were cut into surfaces that were never prepared to receive them. No planning, no design around the text. It looks less like an inscription and more like something added on afterward, almost like graffiti scratched onto a building that already existed. There is another detail that makes this even harder to ignore. Whenever an Egyptian king built a monument for the gods, he almost always included a specific written phrase. Something close to, "He made this as his monument for his father, Osiris." This phrase appears again and again across Egyptian temples. It is completely missing here, not weathered away, not damaged, simply never present at all. Even the entrance itself raises questions. The doorway leading into this structure sits outside the boundary wall of Seti's own temple complex. If Seti had truly built this space as part of his own monument, you would expect the entrance to sit safely inside his temple grounds, not outside it. In 1933, a researcher named Henri Frankfurt offered an explanation to solve all of this. He argued that Seti deliberately built this structure to look ancient on purpose, as a symbolic tribute to Osiris. This idea, known as archaism, became the accepted answer for almost a century. But here is the hole in that explanation that never gets addressed. If Seti's builders were capable of constructing something on this scale, using this level of precision, why does nothing else like it exist anywhere else in the entire history of the New Kingdom? Not before, not after. Used exactly once, then abandoned completely and never touched again. There is one more part of this story that deserves real attention. Margaret Murray, the same careful researcher who explored this site in 1902, spent her life dedicated to studying it directly. She lived to the age of 100, remaining active in her field well into her 90s. Her early first-hand conclusion was clear. She did not believe Seti built this structure. Yet, a generation later, her conclusion was quietly pushed aside, not because new evidence disproved her, but because a different, more convenient explanation became popular instead. If Seti did not build this, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. Who did? And the closest answer is not found anywhere near Abydos. It sits over 300 miles north, at Giza, inside a structure Egyptology has just as much trouble explaining. The twin at Giza. At Giza, standing beside the Great Sphinx, is a structure known as the Valley Temple. It was supposedly built for a king named Khafra over 1,200 years before Seti ever ruled Egypt. And yet, when you place it side by side with the structure behind Seti's temple, the similarities are impossible to ignore. Both are built from massive stone blocks. Both are fitted together without a single drop of mortar. Both share the exact same bare, undecorated style, completely different from the heavily decorated architecture typical of their supposed time periods. Two structures, separated by over 1,000 years and hundreds of miles, built using nearly identical methods. And it does not stop there. The stone walls surrounding the Great Sphinx itself share this same construction style. That is not two matching structures anymore. That is three, spread across different locations and different centuries, all showing signs of the same unexplained building tradition. In 1992, a geologist named Robert Schoch presented findings to the Geological Society of America that shook the foundation of accepted Egyptian history. He pointed to deep, vertical weathering patterns carved into the walls surrounding the Sphinx, patterns that closely match damage caused by heavy rainfall over a very long period of time. The problem is simple. Egypt has not experienced rainfall like that since a period known as the African Humid Period, which ended roughly 5,000 years ago. If Shach is right, the Sphinx itself may be far older than mainstream history claims. This was not a comfortable claim to make. Researchers who publicly support this theory have faced real professional backlash within the field of Egyptology, damaging conversations and reputations simply for stating what the physical evidence appeared to show them. Shach was not alone in pushing these questions further. Engineer Robert Bauval focused on how ancient Egyptian monuments may align with specific star patterns in the sky. Author Graham Hancock later brought these theories to millions of readers around the world, arguing that all of these structures may belong to a shared, older tradition, one that mainstream history has never fully accepted. To be fair, mainstream Egyptology has pushed back hard against these ideas, but here is the honest problem sitting underneath that pushback. The original theory explaining Seti's structure, the one proposed by Frankfurt back in 1933, has been repeated for almost a century. It has never truly been re-examined using modern tools and modern evidence. It has simply been accepted and passed down, unquestioned. Put all of this together, and a clear pattern begins to form. 3 separate structures, different locations, supposedly built over 1,000 years apart, yet built using the same rare, advanced technique that appears nowhere else in Egyptian history. That is not coincidence. That is the fingerprint of something shared, something older, something later generations inherited without fully understanding and eventually lost completely. That shared pattern raises one final, unsettling question. Because if you actually walk into these chambers and measure them against a normal human body, they do not just look ancient. They do not look like they were built for us at all. Built for something else. Inside this structure, the doorway clearances rise higher than 12 feet. That number might sound small on its own, but stand it next to a normal doorway, and the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Most doorways found in Egyptian temples from this era sit at a height clearly built for an average human body. This one rises far beyond that, more than double what a person actually needs to comfortably walk through. And this is not limited to a single doorway. The passageways throughout this entire structure are wider than necessary for normal foot traffic. The ceilings tower far higher than practical use requires. The pillars stretch upward at a scale that goes beyond anything else built in Egypt during this period. Now, there is a fair question worth asking here. Egyptian temples were often built at a grand, symbolic scale on purpose, meant to represent the power and glory of the gods rather than practical human comfort. That is true, and it deserves to be said clearly. But here is where that explanation starts to break down. This kind of oversized symbolic scale usually applied to the outer, public-facing parts of a temple, the parts meant to impress visitors and worshippers. The private internal working spaces inside most temples, the areas actually used daily by priests, remain scaled to normal human proportions. That pattern holds true across Egyptian religious architecture almost everywhere else. This structure breaks that pattern completely. Even its internal passageways, the parts never meant for public display, remain oversized. That is not decoration. That is not symbolism for the sake of impressing outsiders. That is consistency in scale that only makes sense if this space was never built around human proportions to begin with. And here is a detail that deepens the unease even further. Despite being framed as a funeral monument, honoring a god of death, no human remains have ever been recovered from inside this structure. No body, no burial, nothing physically confirming who or what this space was actually built to hold. So we are left with a structure that was clearly never designed for comfortable human use, yet somehow also holds no trace of anyone it was supposedly built for. If this space was never sized for a 19th dynasty pharaoh, and never sized for ordinary human visitors either, the only honest question left is simple and unsettling. Who or what was this space actually built to hold? Nobody has ever given a satisfying answer to that question, and that question has been sitting quietly inside that stone for well over 100 years. Every single year, it becomes harder to answer, because the one thing working against everyone trying to solve this mystery is not time itself, it is water. The mystery being erased. In the 1st century BC, a Greek writer named Strabo traveled through Egypt and wrote about a structure at Abydos that closely matches the one behind Seti's temple. Here is the detail that changes everything about this timeline. Strabo was writing over 1,000 years after Seti's reign had already ended, and in his writings, he never once credited Seti as the builder. Instead, he described it as a monument that was already ancient by the time he laid eyes on it. Think about what that actually means. Ancient Greek travelers were already calling this structure old, mysterious, and unexplained over 1,000 years before modern archaeologists ever stepped foot near it. This mystery has now outlived 2 entire civilizations' worth of curiosity, and it is still unsolved today. And the clock has not stopped. Today, the lower sections of this structure sit below the water table, and that water has only gotten worse over time. After the completion of the Aswan High Dam, groundwater levels across this entire region rose sharply, pushing even more water into a space that was already partially flooded. Here lies a bitter, painful irony sitting at the heart of this entire mystery. A modern engineering project, built to control and manage the Nile River, may now be slowly drowning the very evidence needed to finally understand an ancient engineering mystery that came before it. Recent testing has added an even stranger layer to this story. The water filling this structure today is not simple, ordinary groundwater. It appears to be a mixture that includes ancient Nile water, dating back to before the dam was ever built, rising up through channels that experts still do not fully understand, even now. This creates a painful, practical problem for anyone trying to solve this mystery today. Researchers attempting to study the lower sections of this structure must work through murky water that hides surfaces and blocks close inspection. The very proof that could finally answer these questions is disappearing year after year, while the debate around it continues completely unresolved. So here is where everything we have uncovered finally comes together. Who really quarried and transported that impossible stone? Who carved a name onto a structure that likely belonged to someone else long before they arrived? Who built a nearly identical structure over 1,000 years apart, hundreds of miles away? And who or what this space was truly built to hold, when nothing about its size matches ordinary human beings at all? The structure is still there today, still half buried in water, still standing exactly where it has stood for thousands of years, patiently waiting. And the truth behind it, whatever that truth actually is running out of time, because the water rising around it may finish what a century of confident, convenient answers never could. It may erase the evidence completely before anyone is ever able to prove the truth for certain.